And 180 years later, the descendants of those Māori are fighting for justice.
So look, we're not accusing the banks of doing anything wrong. I think let me just get that clear from the outset.
You know, the idea is that they've privatised the profits but socialised the risk.
The job market is quite tough at the moment, so they will be looking for remedies, and more likely we will get these type of applications.
Hello and welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, Mike McRoberts has been in Nelson, exploring the story of the Nelson Tenths Trust.
For those first European settlers arriving here at Nelson's waterfront, it must have felt like they'd reached the promised land. And in many respects, it was. Except the settlers weren't the only ones promised a piece of this bountiful whenua. An agreement called the Nelson Tenths envisioned a European and Māori settlement.
As part of that agreement by our ancestors to establish Nelson, there was an agreement which came to be known as the Nelson Tenths. So the Nelson settlement was established, but on two really important conditions. The first was that 1/10 of the area, the rohe, would become the Nelson Tenths, reserved in perpetuity for the rangatira and their descendants, our whānau and hapu. And then the second condition was that all of our papakainga lands, our wāhi tapu, the places where we cultivated food, would also be protected from the Nelson settlement.
Carenza Johnston is Chief Executive of the Nelson-based Wakatū Incorporation that's leading the litigation against the Crown. She's also a descendant of the Te Tauihu Māori who signed the original agreement with the New Zealand Company in 1839.
When I think about the New Zealand Company, I sort of think about them as the private developers of the day, but very much supported by the Crown at the time in terms of the development and colonisation project that they had underway. And so a key part, a critical part of that proposal was that relationships with us, with Māori, the Indigenous owners of the land, had to be protected and respected in order essentially to facilitate peaceful colonisation. From our perspective, we were actually really excited about settlers coming into Nelson. We wanted to access technology, education, relationships, and trade for us was particularly important. So we were supportive of the New Zealand Company establishing the settlement here.
Here at Te Mātu, the remains of a totara forest, more than 600 tonnes of potatoes were grown by Māori to feed the incoming settlers. By 1845, a Crown grant was issued acknowledging the New Zealand Company would reserve 1/10 of the land it was settling for Te Tauihu Māori.
And then the Crown actually takes the next step, which is they map out the whole rohe and actually identify all of those reserves on maps, and then begin the process of actually physically making those reserves. And so from 1845 to about 1850, reserves are being created on the ground, but by 1850 the population is starting, the balance is starting to change here in Nelson, and by 1850 the settler population has overtaken the Māori population, and so the balance of power is starting to change from that time onwards.
The dream of settlement here in Nelson back in 1840 should have been a shared dream between the settlers arriving and Māori landowners. The New Zealand Company had set aside a plan for 151,000 acres. 1/10 of that was reserved for Māori, 15,100 acres. It never happened, not even close. And 180 years later, the descendants of those Māori are fighting for justice.
For every area of land that was taken, 1/10 was to be set aside for the descendants of our tupuna, the families of then and the families today.
Kaumātua Rory Stafford is pursuing the claim against the Crown on behalf of Te Tauihu descendants. When did the mana whenua start raising concerns about what was happening?
So our whānau in Hapu started raising concerns about the breaches of the agreement almost from day one. So as it became clear to us, in particular, that our papakainga lands and our wāhi tapu were not being accepted from the Nelson settlement, weren't being protected in the ways that we had agreed, we started to advocate and challenge the decisions that were made. And again, in those early days, that was primarily through petitions, through letters, through visits to Parliament, and trying to advocate with officials around ensuring that the Crown grant would be respected, and in particular that our really significant lands would be protected from the settlement.
Across a wall at Wakatu offices are the 309 names of tupuna, or ancestors, identified in 1892 by the Native Land Court, and whose descendants are now in litigation against the Crown. Many of those tupuna left the region just to survive.
A lot of the evidence that we put before the court when we prepared for this case was around what happened to our whānau through that period. Were they able to live on our lands? And of course the answer is no for the most part. So, while on the one hand we watched the town of Nelson prosper and prosper on our land, we weren't part of that.
The full video is available to watch on nbr.co.nz. Next up, the Commerce Commission has put the big four banks on notice over competition. Jonathan Mitchell spoke to Commission Chair John Small.
Let's look at Kiwibank first. If it was well capitalised, what should its first priorities be?
Look, we're looking to Kiwibank to grow its market share across the board, and start taking chunks out of the big four. That would be the ideal, and it'll be up to them to figure out how to do that.
But i.e., would that be increasing business lending, for example?
Well, it could be, but most banks in New Zealand, they need to balance their books, so they'll need to get in more deposit funding and then lend out as well to grow the whole book. Could be through business lending, could be through more aggressive home loans. But the main thing is that we see them as being, the reason we see them as being a potential disruptor is that they're kind of the closest one to the big four. And we think if they can really put on a spurt, then once they start taking whole percentage points of market share out of one or two of the big four, that will spur a bit of competition as they're growing.
Would that also improve the playing field for niche bank providers and fintechs?
That's a different issue, and we see that as coming in behind Kiwibank, to be honest. Although the exact timing we're not absolutely certain of. But we do see that the niche players, what they need is for all of the big banks to have their APIs up and running as they are now, and have the partnering frameworks in place, so that innovators can get in there and start providing better services, different services, cheaper services to you and I.
You've been critical about a lack of competition. Some banks would disagree with you on that, as well as their levels of profitability. Who's right, who's wrong?
So look, we're not accusing the banks of doing anything wrong. I think, let me just get that clear from the outset. We think they're responding to the environment that they're in, and they're doing the best thing, for their business. We just want to change that environment. On profitability, we've done a lot of extra work on that, including examining expert work that's put to us by ANZ. And we've looked at this about 4 different ways, and this really is a profitable banking sector by international standards. So I'd say we're right on that one. And in terms of competition, I just think we can do a lot better. I'm not saying they're not trying to jostle at the margin, but we think they could be made to work harder for their money.
Well, the government's called it a cosy pillow fight. How would you categorise it?
far be it from me to criticise the Minister of Finance. We've said that we don't see them, these big four, as being strongly competitive. There are times in the market, in history, where we've seen them go after each other a little bit, but then most of the time they're setting fairly modest growth ambitions, and so we think they need a bit of a shake-up.
In terms of open banking, how will that change the game? How will that improve competition and access to money?
So the way that'll work is by allowing firms into the market that have got a completely different business model. These are not the standard banks that we see around New Zealand every day. They're digital native. They're working off different tech stacks. They've got business propositions that are potentially sometimes just targeting one part of a broad suite of banking products, and they're primed for growth, and they're backed by venture capital, and they've seen how things work in other jurisdictions. We've tried to, in our design and our recommendations, we've tried to take the best that we can from other jurisdictions and create an environment that we think is going to be conducive to these firms growing. And so they're just going to bring a whole, a raft of products and services that we haven't seen before.
What now for the Commerce Commission? What are you going to do next?
Well, we've got some aftercare to do on this one, to be honest. We're suggesting to the government that if they designate this interbank payment network, then we can get in behind this open banking initiative and actually help the industry to help itself to get there, so that it's it's kind of industry-led but government-guided, if you like. So we've got quite a bit to do in that space, and we've got quite a few other tasks that we've got on. We've got some big mergers ahead of us, and our normal work in regulating natural monopolies and promoting competition, and there's not many dull moments around here, I'll put it that way.
Well, going forward, if you see that banks are being anti-competitive, how will you respond?
Oh, same as normal. If we find breaches of competition law, we'll prosecute, or we'll nip it in the bud, depending on how serious it is, how long it's been going on for. But yeah, the outcomes that we're after here are highly competitive markets, and that's what our whole organisation is geared towards, those outcomes: highly competitive markets, fair trading, and a good deal on essential services.
Our Australian correspondent, Lachlan Cahoon, stopped by Christopher Luxon's recent trip to Sydney. Here's his analysis of Luxon's suggestion that New Zealand could learn some lessons from how Australia handles infrastructure.
I think the first thing I'd say is the big difference between New South Wales and New Zealand is that Luxon ruled out asset sales to fund infrastructure, whereas in New South Wales, the state government's privatisation has been very controversial, and they've used the proceeds of that to fund the infrastructure. So since 2010, I tallied up that they've sold more than $60 billion in assets, in public assets in New South Wales, and that goes from the Lotteries Commission to all the publicly owned power stations to the poles and wires of the grid. Just about everything that they've sold off, and they've used that $60 billion to fund two really big projects. The first one is the West Connects road project, which connects Western Sydney to the centre of the city, and also the Sydney Metro Rail, which the second part of which opened this week. So West Connects is 33 kilometres of roads connecting the outer part of Sydney to the centre. I mean, I went to Melbourne recently and used it on the way home back to my house, which is in the inner part of Sydney. I encountered my first traffic light about 1 kilometre from my house. Wow. And I was in tunnels and freeways the whole way. So as a piece of engineering, it is absolutely remarkable. And the Sydney Metro is in 3 stages. As I said, stage 2 opened this week. It's going from the north of Sydney to the west of Sydney on driverless trains, travelling at 100 kilometres an hour. And the most you'll have to wait for a train is 10 minutes, apparently.
Wow. So is all of what you're saying an argument for asset sales? I mean, in New Zealand, there's a lot of opposition to it, but are we just being a bit backwards in that regard, do you think?
It's difficult. I think the jury's out, and it depends where you are on the sort of bipartisan spectrum, really. But let's talk about the WestConnex road project, because it was quite controversial, and then that was the main one that was funded by the asset sale. So the cost of that project blew out from an estimated $10 billion to start with to $45 billion. That was over the period of time that it was built. The government then raised $20 billion by selling it. So they spent $45 billion to build it, and private enterprise paid them $20 billion in two tranches to buy it, and it's now owned by a consortium including big super funds and some institutional investors. So there's the cost factor. Are these asset sales really worth it? And when in fact the government's not getting back what they've invested in it. So there's also the time blowout. WestConnex was originally slated for completion in 2019 and opened in late 2023, so 4 or 5 years late. Lots of disruption for people living in the inner city areas. There were tunnels boring under people's houses. People's houses were cracking. The government was saying, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. It's all fine. And then they had to acquire a lot of homes, which in one of the suburbs, which is a Federation suburb, where a lot of the homes were heritage listed. So there was a lot of controversy about it. And ultimately what's happened is now that the government has transferred ownership of WestConnex to private ownership, there are a lot of complaints about people being slugged by the tolls. Because if you live in Western Sydney and you live in the inner and you work in inner Sydney, you'll be paying around $250 a week in tolls to get from your home to work and back every day. So there's that, and also the final thing, which has been controversial, is that they've had to do a lot of landscaping and create some new parks to sort of placate people about the public utility of this road project. And they've discovered that a lot of the soil that has been lugged in by these private contractors contains asbestos. And so they've had to close the parks while they detoxify the parks and get the asbestos out. So yeah, we've got this fantastic new shiny 33-kilometre freeway system, but it's there's been a lot of pain along the way.
Absolutely. And you were talking about the Sydney Metro train project. Have there been problems with that one as well?
Yes, once again, major cost blowouts now estimated $25 billion it will cost. That's $12 billion more than was projected when they came up with the idea. So yes, this week they've opened stage 2, which is the central part of it. People were getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to ride the first train. So there was a bit of a party on the trains. That was yesterday, actually. Yes. But for stage 3, they don't know when they're going to make it, build it. They're going to wait until this section is humming along and performing properly before they can actually come up with a timetable for it. And to build stage 3, they're going to have to close down an existing train line for at least 18 months and move people around on buses while they build it. So there's going to be, once more, a lot of disruption on it. But they say the new inner city stations look lovely, architecturally very beautiful, and there was even an article in the local paper about how great the toilets are.
Wow, that's something. So going back to, would you advise such things? What would your advice be to Christopher Luxon, who's lauding these projects?
I think he needs to work out how he's going to fund them. And that's the first thing. I mean, asset sales are controversial. He's ruled them out. Where does he think he's going to get the money from? Because in both of the cases that I've just outlined, these were big projects undertaken by the state government with public funds initially, even though in the case of WestConnex they sold it down and to private enterprise. So he's talking about public-private partnerships. Where is the money going to come from publicly to get these projects off the ground? So there's that. So he should be careful about funding. He should be careful about over-promising in terms of delivery times. He should be realistic about telling people about the cost of these projects. And he has a big issue to discuss with the public on user pays as well, because in New South Wales, certainly for the WestConnex, now that it's been privatised, people are paying through the nose to drive on these roads. And the idea is that that they've privatised the profits but socialised the risk, and so there's a lot to balance. Yes. One thing that has been, I would say, positive is the creation of Infrastructure New South Wales, and Luxon did visit Infrastructure New South Wales as an agency that sits apart from the political cycle and manages the delivery of these projects in New South Wales. That's a good model in terms of, he talked about depoliticising infrastructure and talked about the creation of an infrastructure agency in New Zealand. I think that's possibly the most positive model from what we've seen in New South Wales that he might employ over in New Zealand.
Luxon also touched on changes to foreign policy under his government. Here's that analysis from political editor Brent Edwards.
So, Brent, what has Prime Minister Christopher Luxon had to say about defence recently?
Well, the Prime Minister was in Australia at the end of last week, spoke to the Lowy Institute in Sydney on Thursday, and then had meetings with the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese on Friday, where defence was discussed, among other things. But, just making the point that the region, the Asia-Pacific region, is, I guess, the security in it is much more suspect than it's ever been in the last 50 years, seeing much greater threats to security, and the security kind of environment is the worst that, seen in our lifetime. I guess he means his lifetime. And so there's the need for greater sort of cooperation between New Zealand and Australia on defence, that New Zealand needs to lift its defence commitment, and just work on improving the security environment by having the two forces being able to operate much more easily together. Now, a lot of this work was already going on before this government took over, under previous governments, including the Labor-led government, but I guess the language seems to be getting a little bit more urgent.
Is the rhetoric being ratcheted up?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably one of the differences, maybe, that the rhetoric could be being ratcheted up. As one commentator said, his speech, or the Prime Minister's speech to the Lowy Institute, had a hawkish tone to it, kind of almost much more confrontational in a sense of calling out China quite a lot for what it's doing. But again, last year in August, the Defence Minister, the Labor government Defence Minister at the time, Andrew Little, released a number of defence reports here in Wellington and specifically talked about China being a threat and talked about the way the Chinese were operating in the Pacific and said that they had to be confronted and would be. So in that sense, not new. So this is kind of, but I guess the concern about China seems to be deepening, and as a result, that kind of balancing act that New Zealand's played really between its Chinese interests, particularly the trade relationship, and remaining on friendly terms, obviously, with the United States and all, it's probably the balance is tilting towards the Americans in a sense that New Zealand seems to be putting its eggs in that basket more and more, rather than trying to, as it's had for quite a few years, walk a path down the middle.
What are the consequences then?
Well, the consequences are, and we've had, for instance, former Labor Prime Minister Helen Clark, who signed the free trade agreement with China in 2008, and a former National Party leader, Don Brash, warning against the approach that the government's taking, particularly in relationship to considering signing Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement, and raising concerns about what it would do in terms of trade with China. So those are some of the consequences that could happen if the Chinese became annoyed about looking at New Zealand's position. Could it make trade between the two countries more difficult? Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, Christopher Luxon he said you couldn't have prosperity without security, and truth in that. But equally, if the government continues to be so open in its criticism of China and antagonises the Chinese government, might that then be reflected possibly in some trade kickback, which would affect prosperity, because New Zealand has obviously benefited a lot in the last 15 years or so by that big increase in trade with China.
Brent Edwards, thank you.
Finally, instead of being made redundant, should you be offered a new job overseas? Dita DeBoni takes a look in this week's Toil and Trouble.
So, like is happening all over the place at the moment in New Zealand, his role was considered for redundancy. There were 2 people in his role in New Zealand, and what was interesting about this case is he had been put into work where he was not doing billable work for a period at the request of the company, and he'd gone and he'd started doing this other work. And then when roles were considered for redundancy, they looked at the 2 roles, his and this other person's, and went, oh, well, you're not billable, the other person's work is billable, so we're going to select your role for redundancy. So there was kind of this pre-selection based on whether they were billable or not. And the difficulty with that is he'd actually been doing that work at the request of the company with the promise that there would be this billable work later. And so he said, well, I just don't think that's unfair, what's happened to me there.
Yeah, right. So he was restructured out but took a personal grievance?
That's right. So he took a personal grievance claim, and as part of that claim he made an application to the Employment Relations Authority for interim reinstatement into his role. And what interim reinstatement is, or what reinstatement is it's one of the remedies you can seek under the Employment Relations Act. So you can seek money, compensation, but you can also say, hey, look, I've been so badly treated, I think what happened to me was wrong, and I think you should put me back in my former role. Now that kind of strikes fear in the heart of employers, but it is what's called the primary remedy under the legislation, meaning if it is reasonable and practicable to do so, then the courts have to put you back in the role that if you want to. And so it's looked at really seriously. And then in his case, he did this thing called interim reinstatement, which is an urgent application saying, look, we haven't heard my main case yet. That's going to take some time. In the meantime, I'm really suffering. So put me back in my role now, just for the now, and then then we can look at the case substantively later down the road. And so he sought that. He was granted it in the authority, and then his employer appealed to the employment court, who reconsidered the matter, and that's what this decision is that we're talking about.
But how can he be reinstated to a role that's been
made redundant? I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think this is what makes this case so interesting in this time of redundancies and when employees will take cases, because the job market is quite tough at the moment, so they will be looking for remedies. And more likely we will get these type of applications where someone says, look, I think I've been treated unfairly and now there's no jobs out there. So what am I to do? Well, I'm going to get my old job back. And even although it can be quite impracticable sometimes, so long as it's not completely unpractical, impracticable is the word they use, then the authority might put them back into the job. And they sort of weigh up the strength of the case, and they weigh up the sort of who's going to suffer the most. And in his case, because we are dealing with an international, now they're not a massive conglomerate, but they are, a large group of companies across the world, the view was held by the court that he can go back into his existing job in the meantime. What often happens in these cases in practical reality is that the parties will settle sometimes afterwards, and in this case they have been referred to mediation. So I'd say there's a reasonable chance that rather than have him back into a role that they really don't want to exist anymore, that they may try and settle this out. But that's me making some assumptions there.
I mean, I was going to say, if there were 2 people, one position is gotten rid of, and that person comes back, in a circumstance where that process has already happened, what happens? I mean, is someone displaced from their job, or they just keep the 2 jobs?
They would just have to keep the 2 jobs or find other work to do. And in his case, there was some evidence to suggest that there were other roles that he potentially could be redeployed into. So with his agreement, he could potentially go back into that job he was actually doing when he was made redundant, the other non-billable work, which they did seem to need to have an ongoing need for. Right. And so assuming they do have an ongoing need for that, they could say to him, well, look, okay, come back in because we've been ordered to bring you back in, but can you do this work in the meantime? And he would need to act reasonably and in good faith around that. One would think he would probably be grateful and do it. We don't kind of know what might happen, I guess. It would be hard for him to go back into that. Yes. You can imagine how difficult that would be, but that I think is a sign of how desperate people are sometimes.
But the fact that he could go back into work of which the company had a need suggests they were trying to get rid of him.
Yeah, look, that can be the case. It's hard to know. This was the restructuring is happening over the Australia-New Zealand division of the business, and so it looked like there was cost cutting being done at all areas. And so this case he did raise whether there was improper motives in terms of trying to get rid of him, but the court didn't make any finding on that, and it's hard to know. The reality is that sometimes employers will pre-select people for redundancy because they don't want to keep them, and they perceive redundancy as being like an easy way through. And I think the lesson of this case is I'm not saying these guys were treating it like this at all, because there's no evidence of that before the court. But if that is what employers are thinking, I'll just make them redundant, it'll be so much easier. Like, it's not. And I think that this case is an important lesson for that in a number of ways, actually. Yeah.
And another important thing that the judge said was that there was no reason not to consider redeployment outside New Zealand.
That's right. And so because this was a group of companies and they were essentially under a parent group, what the judge said is, look, you should have at least considered whether there are alternatives. Now, that might have not meant him physically going overseas, of course, in these days of work from home, remote, locations. But the point being, and I think this is where the case is perhaps a little bit novel, a little bit new, is saying you should have at least looked, what was there in Australia? What was there in the rest in Asia Pacific? Was there something that he could have done, and at least turn your mind to it? And I think what this all boils down to is that redundancy should be a last resort. Now, that's been said in the case law before. We should only be making people redundant when there is no other alternative. And so what the judge is now saying is, if you're part of a wider group, you may need to be a bit more open-minded about how you think about that. And I think it does come back to, did they have a mindset about this guy? Maybe, and just weren't willing. I mean, they certainly, he came up with some other ideas for the way the work could be redistributed, where maybe his job could be kept. And it seems like the company just didn't really engage with that. Right. That's another thing the judge has said. Look, if your employer comes up with some ideas, you've got to at least consider them. You've got to at least engage with that. Explore it through, tease it out a bit more. Don't just kind of say, no, we don't want to do that. So there's a few little object lessons in there for employers about taking care with these processes and these decisions.
Absolutely. And just as a side issue, if the company said, look, we've got a job in Adelaide, you could do that job, what kind of responsibility do they have to move the employee and set them up? That's a financial cost to them too.
Yeah, that's right. And so companies don't in those circumstances have an obligation. Some companies would have a policy that would apply where they would actually help people with relocation costs, but that would be something for the employee to consider, whether or not they could afford to do that in their current context. But the point is just giving them the opportunity, actually just saying, look, there's a list of other vacancies, there's a few things that you're doing. Here's the worldwide list, or here's the Australia, New Zealand list, and redeployment is hard because employers sometimes don't want to say, look, here's a job which is that the person's completely unsuited for, and that's appropriate that they don't do that. Yeah. Or here's a job that's significantly junior with less pay. They're worried it could be insulting, and that's a reasonable concern. But at the end of the day, you actually won't lose anything by just saying, look, here's the list. This is what we've got going on. Some of these are not, clearly not for you because they're not the ones. But we're open-minded. If there's any of these you're interested in, and we think you can do them, we'll put you in them. So because why would you want to lose a good person, assuming they are a good person? So we come back to that. But and so it's just a little an open-mindedness around and an expense. I think it's about expansive thinking rather than restricted thinking. If we can redeploy this person, why would we not?
Well, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching. We do appreciate it. Remember, for all the business news you can use, nbr.co.nz.